The name Augusto Pinochet Ugarte evokes sharply divided reactions. To some, he is the man who saved Chile from the throes of communism. To others, he is a dictator whose reign was marred by human rights violations, repression, and fear. Born into modest circumstances and rising through the ranks of the Chilean military, Pinochet would come to symbolize one of Latin America's most brutal yet economically transformative regimes. His life, legacy, and the historical context in which he operated remain critical to understanding the modern history of Chile and the global discourse on authoritarianism, neoliberalism, and transitional justice. Pinochet's rule from 1973 to 1990 left an indelible mark on the Chilean psyche and world politics. From the violent coup that ousted Salvador Allende to the economic reforms that liberalized Chile's market at a great human cost, Pinochet's life encapsulates the contradictions of power, ideology, and legacy. This essay explores the complexity of his life and impact, analyzing his rise, his governance, and the aftermath that still reverberates in Chile today. Augusto José Ramón Pinochet Ugarte was born on November 25, 1915, in the coastal city of Valparaiso, Chile. His lineage was a blend of French and Basque ancestry, and he was raised in a devout Catholic household. His father, Augusto Pinochet Vera, worked in customs, providing the family a modest but stable life. From an early age, young Augusto exhibited an affinity for discipline, order, and authority, qualities that would later define his military and political career. In 1933, at the age of 18, Pinochet entered the military school in Santiago. His time there was unremarkable academically, but he quickly earned a reputation for being meticulous and obedient. He graduated as an infantry officer in 1937, beginning a long military career that would slowly elevate him through the ranks. Over the next 3 decades, he served in various regions of Chile, steadily gaining experience and cultivating relationships within the military establishment. Pinochet was also a voracious reader with a particular interest in geopolitics and national security. He translated and wrote several texts on military strategy, demonstrating a deep engagement with the theoretical dimensions of warfare and governance. In 1953, he married Lucia Hiriart Rodriguez, with whom he had 5 children. Lucia would later become one of his staunchest allies and defenders. During the Cold War, Chile's military, like many in Latin America, was influenced by the U.S. military doctrine of containment and anti-communism. The School of the Americas, based in the Panama Canal Zone and later in the United States, trained many Chilean officers, including Pinochet. These institutions inculcated the belief that Marxist ideology posed an existential threat, not just to national stability but to Western civilization itself. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Chile was undergoing significant political upheaval. The nation had long been considered one of the more stable democracies in Latin America, but it faced mounting economic inequality, polarization, and calls for structural change. In 1970, Chile elected Salvador Allende, the world's first democratically elected Marxist president, ushering in a period of profound reform and escalating tension. Pinochet, at the time, was not yet a household name. He continued his ascent through the military hierarchy, known for his professionalism and loyalty to civilian authority. In 1971, he was promoted to brigadier general, and in 1973, mere weeks before the military coup, President Allende appointed him commander-in-chief of the Chilean army, a move that Allende believed would preserve stability. But behind the scenes, Chile's armed forces were already plotting. The Nixon administration in the United States, along with the CIA, had been working covertly to destabilize Allende's government, fearing the spread of socialism in Latin America. Economic sabotage, strikes, and political unrest were tearing the country apart. The stage was set for military intervention, and Pinochet, despite his late involvement in the planning, emerged as the man who would take command of Chile's future. On the morning of September 11, 1973, the Chilean military launched a coup d'état that would forever change the nation. Tanks rolled into the streets of Santiago, and warplanes bombed La Moneda Palace, where President Allende made his final stand. Refusing to resign, Allende delivered a farewell address to the nation via radio before taking his own life as soldiers stormed the building. Pinochet, who had been promoted just 2 weeks prior, was now at the helm of a military junta composed of leaders from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and National Police, Carabineros. Though initially framed as a collective leadership, Pinochet quickly consolidated power. By December 1974, he declared himself Supreme Chief of the nation and later, President of the Republic. The coup was followed by an immediate and brutal crackdown. Thousands of leftists, activists, academics, and suspected dissidents were arrested, tortured, disappeared, or executed. The National Stadium of Santiago became a makeshift detention center and site of atrocities. The regime established the feared Directorate of National Intelligence, DINA, a secret police force responsible for systematic repression. The coup drew swift condemnation and support from various quarters. Many Western governments, especially the United States under Nixon and Kissinger, supported Pinochet as a bulwark against communism. Meanwhile, human rights organizations, intellectuals, and the global left decried the junta's crimes against humanity. Chile was no longer a democracy, it was now under the grip of a military dictatorship. While Pinochet's repression of dissent was swift and total, his economic policies marked a dramatic shift in Chilean governance. Initially, the junta faced a collapsed economy with high inflation, food shortages, and widespread discontent. Pinochet turned to a group of economists trained at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman, later known as the Chicago Boys. These neoliberal reformers advocated for radical free market policies, privatization of state-owned industries, deregulation, slashing of tariffs, and the elimination of subsidies. Pinochet gave them carte blanche. Within a few years, Chile transformed into a laboratory of economic liberalism. The results were mixed and remained fiercely debated. Inflation was tamed, foreign investment increased, and GDP began to rise. However, unemployment soared, social safety nets were dismantled, and income inequality deepened. Public education and healthcare suffered under privatization, and the reforms disproportionately harmed the working class and indigenous communities. Pinochet's regime was praised by neoliberals around the world for its economic miracle, and Chile became a model for other developing nations. But this success came at the cost of immense human suffering. Economic liberty, in Pinochet's Chile, was inextricably tied to political authoritarianism. Critics argued that the supposed miracle masked deep social scars and long-term vulnerabilities. Pinochet's iron grip extended beyond economics. Between 1973 and 1990, thousands of Chileans were subjected to enforced disappearances, torture, and political imprisonment. The Rettig report, released in 1991, would later confirm over 3,000 deaths and disappearances, while other estimates suggest the number of torture victims exceeded 30,000. The regime's secret police operated through networks of informants, clandestine detention centers, and cross-border assassinations. One of the most infamous cases was the 1976 assassination of former Chilean ambassador Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C., orchestrated by DINA. This brought international attention to Pinochet's extraterritorial repression and stained Chile's international reputation. The Vatican, Amnesty International, and various UN bodies denounced the abuses. However, Cold War dynamics meant that many Western governments remained cautious in their criticism. For decades, survivors and families of the disappeared fought an uphill battle for truth, justice, and reparations. Pinochet, aware that indefinite military rule would eventually erode legitimacy even among conservatives, sought to institutionalize his power through legal means. In 1980, the regime presented a new constitution to the Chilean people via a plebiscite. The constitution, crafted largely behind closed doors by a group of Pinochet-aligned technocrats and jurists, was meant to codify the junta's authority, consolidate executive power, and lay a path for controlled democratization. Despite widespread irregularities in the vote and heavy censorship, the 1980 plebiscite passed with nearly 67% support according to official results. The new constitution came into force on March 11, 1981, formally making Pinochet the president of Chile for an 8-year term, with a mechanism to extend his rule via another plebiscite in 1988. The constitution enshrined military prerogatives and gave the armed forces vast control over civilian affairs, creating a protected democracy, in which true opposition was structurally handicapped. The 1980 constitution also granted legal immunity to the military for actions committed during the coup and its aftermath. A National Security Council was established with vast oversight powers, and the judiciary remained largely subservient to executive authority. Through these instruments, Pinochet's rule became not just de facto but de jure. He was now, by law, the embodiment of the state. Despite the outward appearance of order, Pinochet's Chile was gripped by a pervasive culture of fear. Dissent was not merely discouraged, it was brutally punished. Universities were purged of leftist professors, unions were suppressed, and student protests were crushed with lethal force. Surveillance became ubiquitous, and the mere whisper of criticism could result in abduction or torture. Yet resistance persisted. In the early 1980s, economic instability, triggered by a global recession and financial crises, fueled growing public discontent. The same neoliberal reforms that had pleased foreign investors had devastated local industries and widened the wealth gap. In 1982, Chile faced its worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, and public opinion began to shift. Civil society organizations, including churches, human rights groups, and exiled intellectuals, began organizing in earnest. Mass protests erupted in 1983, spearheaded by labor unions and students. Though the regime responded with violence, including the use of live ammunition and mass detentions, the protests signaled that the fear that had gripped Chile was beginning to loosen. Cultural resistance also flourished underground. Music, literature, and visual arts became powerful tools of defiance. Artists used symbolism, metaphor, and hidden language to critique the regime. The Catholic Church played a significant role in protecting activists and documenting abuses, with the Vicariate of Solidarity becoming a critical node in the human rights struggle. By the mid-1980s, international and domestic pressure on Pinochet was mounting. The Reagan administration, initially supportive, began distancing itself amid rising human rights criticism. European governments and the United Nations issued repeated condemnations. Inside Chile, the opposition coalesced into a broad coalition, the Concertación de Partidos por la Democracia. The 1988 plebiscite was Pinochet's attempt to secure another 8-year term under the 1980 constitution. Confident in his control over state machinery and the absence of a truly free press, he underestimated the opposition's resolve and unity. The No campaign, launched under the banner, Chile, La Alegría Viene, Chile, Joy is Coming, ran an unprecedented 15-minute nightly TV spot showcasing testimonials, humor, and hope. The campaign energized the population. On October 5, 1988, over 7.5 million Chileans voted in the plebiscite. To the shock of the regime, 55% voted no, effectively rejecting Pinochet's continued rule. Despite some initial signs of reluctance, the military and political elites eventually accepted the result. The following year, democratic reforms were initiated. In 1989, Patricio Aylwin, a Christian Democrat, won the presidency in a historic election. On March 11, 1990, Augusto Pinochet stepped down as president, but not as commander-in-chief of the army. He would remain in that position until 1998, ensuring continued influence. Even after stepping down, Pinochet ensured legal insulation for himself and his allies. The 1980 Constitution granted him the status of Senator for Life, affording parliamentary immunity. Numerous amnesty laws passed during his rule further complicated any attempt to hold him accountable for human rights violations. Still, Chilean society was far from unified in its assessment of the past. While many viewed Pinochet as a tyrant, others, particularly among the business elite and military families, saw him as a savior. Streets, schools, and monuments continued to bear his name, and the judiciary remained hesitant to prosecute high-ranking military officers. The 1990s saw the beginning of a slow and contentious reckoning. The National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation, REDIG report, and later the Valek report documented extensive human rights violations, including torture, murder, and disappearances. These reports provided official acknowledgement, but legal accountability remained elusive. The military, still powerful, resisted judicial inquiries. Many families of the disappeared continued their search for answers. The slogan "Donde están?" Where are they? Became a haunting refrain in public discourse, echoed in graffiti, songs, and marches. Chile, though democratic again, was struggling with the ghost of its past. In 1998, while receiving medical treatment in London, Augusto Pinochet was arrested on a Spanish warrant issued by Judge Baltasar Garzón. The charges included genocide, torture, and crimes against humanity. The arrest stunned the world and marked a turning point in international law. For the first time, a former head of state was detained abroad for crimes committed in his home country. The British legal proceedings dragged on for 16 months. Pinochet's legal team argued that he was too ill to stand trial. Eventually, Home Secretary Jack Straw allowed him to return to Chile in 2000 on medical grounds. He was welcomed home by supporters as a hero, but the tide was turning. The arrest in London shattered the myth of Pinochet's untouchability. It emboldened Chilean judges and prosecutors. Over the following years, dozens of cases were opened against him for human rights abuses, tax evasion, and corruption. Pinochet was placed under house arrest multiple times but never imprisoned. A 2004 investigation revealed that Pinochet had hidden over $27 million in secret accounts across the globe, undermining his image as an austere and incorruptible soldier. The revelation of such wealth, especially when juxtaposed with the economic hardship many Chileans had faced, fueled anger and calls for justice. Augusto Pinochet died on December 10, 2006, of a heart attack, at the age of 91. He passed away without ever facing a full trial or conviction. His death sparked celebration in some quarters and mourning in others. The Chilean government, under President Michelle Bachelet, herself a survivor of Pinochet's torture centers, refused to grant him a state funeral. Thousands took to the streets to either pay tribute or express relief. His legacy, even in death, remained as polarizing as ever. For many, he was the architect of Chile's economic rise; for others, he was a criminal who escaped justice. His funeral was marked by the presence of high-ranking military officials but no international dignitaries. Pinochet left behind a deeply divided nation. The struggle to define his legacy had only just begun. Evaluating Augusto Pinochet's legacy is among the most contentious tasks facing historians and political scientists. It is a conversation fractured across ideological lines, generational divides, and global perceptions. To some, Pinochet represents a necessary evil, an authoritarian leader who rescued Chile from Marxist collapse and set the nation on a path to economic modernization. To others, he is a symbol of terror, injustice, and the betrayal of Chile's democratic ideals. The contradictions are profound. Pinochet presided over one of Latin America's most notorious police states, yet also laid the economic foundations that would later contribute to Chile's relative prosperity in the region. He dismantled democratic institutions but also oversaw a transition to democracy, albeit reluctantly and on his own terms. These complexities have made it difficult to place him in a simple moral category, and that ambiguity remains a central element of his historical footprint. In Chile itself, Pinochet's shadow lingers heavily. Polls conducted in the years following his death show a persistent divide in public opinion. Roughly one-third of Chileans, especially older generations and right-leaning citizens, continued to hold a favorable view of him well into the 2010s. Conversely, the younger population, especially those raised in democratic Chile, tend to view him as a tyrant whose regime perpetrated egregious human rights abuses. The debate over Pinochet's legacy is not just academic, it is political, personal, and alive. Pinochet's regime has often been compared to other Cold War-era authoritarian governments, particularly those in Latin America. The 1970s and 1980s saw a wave of military dictatorships across the region, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay among them. Many of these governments were part of Operation Condor, a coordinated campaign of cross-border repression against leftist dissidents, supported tacitly or explicitly by the United States. In this context, Pinochet stands out for the precision of his repression and the longevity of his control. While Argentina's military regime fell in disgrace in 1983 after the Falklands War, and Brazil returned to civilian rule in 1985, Pinochet remained in power until 1990 and retained institutional clout even afterward. His dictatorship was arguably the most ideologically coherent of the Southern Cone regimes, fusing anti-Marxism with neoliberalism in a lasting way. Globally, Pinochet has become an archetype in debates about benevolent dictatorships or authoritarian capitalism. His economic reforms were hailed by figures such as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, while human rights activists decried them as legitimizing cruelty. The Pinochet model has been referenced, sometimes with admiration, often with caution, by leaders in countries as diverse as China, Russia, and Singapore. Yet the central question persists: can economic development ever justify authoritarian rule and systemic violence? For many, Pinochet is a cautionary tale that warns against trading freedom for prosperity. In the years following his death, Chile continued its slow march toward reckoning with the past. Courts have, over time, convicted dozens of former military officers and intelligence officials for crimes committed during the dictatorship. The most notorious among them include Manuel Contreras, the head of DINA, who was sentenced to over 500 years in prison for his role in kidnappings, torture, and murder. Truth commissions such as the Rettig Report, 1991, and Valek Report, 2004, documented the scope of the repression. Their findings led to government reparations, including pensions for victims' families and memorialization efforts. However, justice has often moved slowly, and many perpetrators remain free due to legal loopholes or advanced age. Chile's judicial system, long seen as compromised during the dictatorship, began showing more independence in the 2000s. Cases once deemed untouchable, such as the Caravan of Death or the Letelier assassination, became focal points for national discussion. Despite these strides, many Chileans continue to feel that justice remains incomplete. The Museum of Memory and Human Rights, opened in 2010 in Santiago, is one of the most powerful public acknowledgments of the dictatorship's crimes. Yet even the museum has faced criticism from conservative factions who accuse it of bias or of failing to honor the positive side of Pinochet's legacy. Perhaps one of the most enduring aspects of Pinochet's legacy is the 1980 Constitution. Despite reforms over the years, including a 2005 revision under President Ricardo Lagos, the constitutional framework retained many features designed to shield the military and conservative interests. In October 2019, widespread protests erupted across Chile, sparked by a transit fare hike but driven by deeper grievances: inequality, privatized education and healthcare, and a sense of political disenfranchisement. Protesters frequently invoked Pinochet's legacy, denouncing the lingering structures of dictatorship embedded in Chile's democracy. This unrest led to a national plebiscite in 2020, in which nearly 80% of Chileans voted to draft a new constitution. The symbolic and legal break from the Pinochet-era charter was seen by many as a long-overdue step toward true democracy. However, the constitutional process has since faced challenges and divisions, reflecting how deeply rooted the contradictions of the past remain. The Pinochet legacy is not a relic of history, it is a living, breathing part of the Chilean present. The institutions he built, the inequalities he entrenched, and the wounds he opened still shape the nation's political discourse. As with many authoritarian figures, Pinochet's memory has become a battleground. In right-wing political circles, especially among the Chilean far-right, he is remembered as a patriot who saved the country. Figures in the UDI, Independent Democratic Union, and other conservative parties often invoke his legacy when criticizing leftist movements. Conversely, progressive movements, student organizations, and social activists continue to hold annual memorials for the victims of the dictatorship. For them, remembering is an act of resistance. Nunca más, never again, is a rallying cry not just against Pinochet, but against the re-emergence of authoritarianism anywhere. The digital age has further complicated the narrative. On social media, younger generations debate Pinochet's record with access to more information than ever before, but also more misinformation. Revisionist accounts often downplay the regime's crimes, promoting a sanitized version of history. This struggle over memory is not unique to Chile, but it is particularly acute in a nation where the past still casts such a long shadow. Documentaries, books, and films continue to dissect the Pinochet years, with works like Pablo Larraín's No, 2012, and The Battle of Chile, 1975 to 1979, serving as cultural milestones. These works not only preserve memory but shape public consciousness. Pinochet's personal life has also been subject to scrutiny. His wife, Lucia Ugarte, was investigated for corruption and misuse of public funds in her role as president of the SEMA Chile Foundation, an organization originally meant to help women and families. The Pinochet family accumulated significant wealth during his rule, much of it under dubious circumstances. These revelations further eroded the myth of austerity that Pinochet had carefully cultivated. While many Chileans struggled through economic reforms, the Pinochet family lived comfortably, their fortunes shielded by secrecy and influence. The fall from grace in the public eye was not just political, it was also moral. Pinochet's children have had varied public roles, some defending his legacy vocally, others retreating from the limelight. His daughter, Lucia Pinochet Ugarte, served as a municipal councillor and continued to express admiration for her father's achievements. For many families of victims, the personal trauma of the dictatorship remains unresolved. The search for the bodies of the disappeared continues. Every year, survivors return to the sites of torture, now memorialized, to remember and to mourn. The dictatorship was not just a political phenomenon, it was an intimate wound that altered the lives of hundreds of thousands. The life and legacy of Augusto Pinochet offer a profound lesson about the fragility of democracy, the seduction of power, and the price of ideological extremism. His rule demonstrates how fear can be weaponized, how institutions can be hollowed from within, and how economic success can be used to obscure injustice. Chile today is a democracy, but it is a democracy born of struggle, compromise, and ongoing contestation. The fact that it took over 3 decades to meaningfully challenge the Pinochet-era constitution is testament to how enduring authoritarian structures can be. And yet, the courage of those who resisted, many of whom paid with their lives, speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. As countries around the world grapple with authoritarian backsliding, disinformation, and populist strongmen, the Chilean experience holds urgent relevance. Pinochet's Chile shows how quickly freedoms can vanish, and how long it can take to restore them. Augusto Pinochet Ugarte died without facing trial, but his legacy remains on trial in the hearts, minds, and streets of Chile. For every monument defaced in protest, every declassified document released, and every young person who marches for justice, his legacy is being redefined. The story of Pinochet is not finished. It lives in courtrooms, in classrooms, in museums, and in memory. He was a soldier, a dictator, a reformer, a criminal, a savior to some, and a monster to others. In trying to understand him, we confront the fundamental questions of power, morality, and memory. His life forces us to ask not just what happened, but what should never happen again.